All right, well, thank you very much for coming. And Ava, thank you very much for presenting tonight. And so I'll just hand it over to you. Take it over.
Okay, awesome. Hi, guys. My name is Ava Chavla. So I lead our cloud security efforts at a company called AlgoSec. We are known for secure application connectivity anywhere, which means we have very rich expertise in terms of network security, looking across the hybrid state. And now we're really building out and investing in the cloud in terms of CNAP, and Kubernetes is an area where I would say we differentiate. And so I really started to dig deep. Now, the talk that I'm going to do today doesn't necessarily have anything to do with AlgoSec or what we're doing, but more so kind of how to think about security of containers and specifically Kubernetes. And so we'll talk about the agenda, but a little bit about my background. Before I joined AlgoSec, I spent quite a number of years at Amazon Web Services as a senior customer solutions manager and a senior leader for digital native, where I worked with a lot of customers in terms of migrations and modernization. A lot of the modernization efforts included moving from maybe EC2 instances over to containerized applications. And so I started to become very familiar with containers through my time at Amazon. Before Amazon, I spent a number of years in the intelligence community, doing a variety of roles, touching a variety of technologies, cloud and infrastructure being one of them, as well as deep sort of expertise around identity access management and security of that infrastructure and those cloud environments. So that's a little bit about me. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my camera because I have some notes, and I want to focus on the content and really making sure that I give you guys all the information I want to give you guys. So with that, let's just go into the slides. Hopefully everyone can see them. And actually, I'm just going to move the screen a little bit. Please don't mind. So hopefully everyone can see the slides. And let's just look at the agenda. Sorry, was there a comment?
No, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So from an agenda perspective, we're going to talk about, known containers and Kubernetes exploits. And so starting to delve into why is container security so important, and, why are we having this conversation, right? And then we'll go into best practices. This slide deck was created for, I think, a talk that takes much longer time, so I won't necessarily get into the bottom three, but instead, once we talk about best practices, I'll dive a little bit deeper into different tools and then things that you might look for as you think about building a cloud security program, and then we'll begin to wrap at least this session there. And so, why are we having this talk? Why is it so important? I don't know where everyone's level is in terms of Kubernetes, but and containers, but really, like, as we see continued momentum towards containers because of the efficiencies that containers enable in terms of being able to share the underlying OS, with that trend comes a need to really think about security differently, because when we think about containers, they don't really offer a strong security boundary, right? They have some restrictions on shared access of the resources on the host, but they don't prevent malicious actors. And when we think about containers, you have image repositories, open source images that you can access, but you don't know oftentimes what's in them. And again, you can introduce vulnerabilities into your environment without knowing. We'll talk about, supply chain and how that fits in as well. But, potentially having vulnerabilities arise from insecure libraries or other dependencies from an image you might be using, things like that. And so that's why we're here. That's why we're talking about container security, and that's the focus for this conversation. And so let's just dive in, I guess, with this agenda. So to start, I just thought maybe throwing out some stats out there. Like I think the number one sort of reason for breaches just in cloud in general tends to be misconfigurations. It's, one of those things that's so easily avoidable yet happens all the time. And the same is true for containers. Like one of the top concerns for containers is just, have you configured your container properly? And so I have some stats here. A Red Hat 2022 report reported that 53% of detected Kubernetes security misconfigurations were found in the last 12 months, right? And so a lot of what you're going to find around security vulnerabilities comes with misconfiguring your Kubernetes containers. And so as we look at that, some of the risks come just because of the security boundaries and the vulnerabilities that maybe are present when you go to a library, you pull an image, and you don't realize that that image has some identified vulnerabilities. And so you can look at the vulnerabilities that have been identified in the past. So vulnerabilities in 2022 alone. If anyone has heard of Dirty Pipe, and you can Google it, you can look it up. It's a Linux kernel vulnerability that allows the ability of non-privileged users to overwrite read-only files. Like, that's one example of a vulnerability that could be present that was found in 2022. And then there's others, right, that I have listed here, and you can dig as deep as you want into these. You can Google it. By the way, if anyone wants a copy of these slides, I'm happy to give that afterwards. I'll share my email and I can provide it. As far as misconfigurations go, right, making sure that your containers are configured with the right permissions, right, and you're applying the principle of least privilege. Like, that's where sometimes misconfigurations can come in. You've got malware that you've got to look out for when it comes to container risks. And so if we kind of dive a little bit deeper, one example of something pretty recent is AzureScape. And AzureScape was disclosed by Microsoft. It's specific to the Azure container instances. And it's really interesting because it starts with enabling an actor to break out of their Azure container instances. And then from there, take control by gaining admin privileges over a multi-tenant Kubernetes cluster. And so then all of a sudden they can gain control of and take over a larger environment, a larger account. And so again, another example of a vulnerability, this one announced by Microsoft. And you'll begin to see, as vulnerabilities get identified, they'll be announced. And it's really important when you're using containers that you're constantly scanning your images on the lookout for these vulnerabilities, for these misconfigurations. Your top 10, Kubernetes risks that were, identified, and I have links here. Again, I'll share the slides, but this is a list. I'm not going to read through this list, but you can see there's 1 to 10. And in the next slides, we'll go a little bit deeper into each of these risks, but I'll give everyone a moment to just look at the slide. And, sorry, give me a minute here. Did I stop sharing? No.
Nope, you're good.
Okay, good. Where did I lost my browser. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the first one, the insecure workload configurations. When we think about workloads or security context of workloads in Kubernetes, Kubernetes is highly configurable, right? And so when we think about how we're configuring these workloads, we shouldn't be running applications, or application processes should not be run as root. And so that's one of the things to be aware of when we think about insecure workload configurations. The other thing is, read-only file systems should probably be used in order to manage your workload configurations and set them properly. And if you do that, then you're limiting the impact of any compromised container on a Kubernetes node. Privileged containers should be disallowed, right? And when we think about trying to prevent and identify these scenarios where you've got insecure workload configurations, you want to enforce some rules, right? Enforce that you cannot run anything as you cannot run as a root user. You want to run as a non-privileged mode. You want to set some allowed privilege, or you want to set your allowed privilege escalation to false. And you can use open source tools like Open Policy Agent, which can be used as a policy engine to detect some of these misconfigurations and identify some of these risks, at least when we talk about insecure workload configurations. And you can actually use Open Policy Agent for some of these other risks that we'll talk about as well. Oops, I went ahead. Supply chain vulnerabilities. So this one is very relevant for Kubernetes, right? Because when we're talking about Kubernetes or containers in general, you're going to your image libraries, you're maybe taking an image and you don't know necessarily the different paths or what's what third-party components or dependencies are making up the trust of origin for that particular image. And so it's really important to sort of understand the image integrity and where that image came from if you can, and sometimes you can't, right? There was a SolarWinds breach attack. I can't remember when it occurred, but that attack was a result of risks that were present in the supply chain. When we talk about container images, they consist of many layers, right? Each command is a layer. And so understanding and being able to break down the image to its layers and see where different vulnerabilities are present. So if you're using a tool that does a static scan for vulnerabilities with your container images, it would be great if that tool breaks down those images down to its layers and can show you at which particular layer the vulnerabilities might be present. A lot of times that there'll be known software vulnerabilities that might be present in an image due to third-party packages, and as these vulnerabilities get identified, they're getting documented, and so these third-party tools that are scanning based on known vulnerabilities that have been identified, that have been recorded, and it's searching your image to make sure those vulnerabilities are not present, right? But again, when you think about a scanning tool, it's good to have something that can break down the image down to its layers and show you at what layers those vulnerabilities are present. And so when we think about a tool that can help you manage your supply chain vulnerabilities, obviously understanding the different layers, but also if you can identify a tool that can provide a software bill of materials, or basically a tool that gives you a list of software packages, licenses, and libraries of that artifact, of that image, so you can be able to understand the components. That can be really helpful. If you have a tool that enables image signing, so basically the ability to use cryptographic keys to sign and verify the artifact at each step in the supply chain or during your DevOps process, that's another way of managing and hopefully preventing any vulnerability risks that come as a result of the supply chain itself, right? And so that's, supply chain vulnerabilities is another top one to think about. So the next one we're going to talk about is overly permissive role-based access control configurations. Now, role-based access control, authorization is really the primary mechanism in Kubernetes for enabling permission over resources. And when we talk about role-based access control, we're talking about is we're talking about enforcing, being able to enforce kind of at the service account, user, or group access level what actions can be performed, what resources can be accessed. And so as we think about role-based access control, making sure that those permissions are accurate and specific to just what needs to be specific, right? So making sure that a service account, user, or group doesn't have like some, cluster admin super user permission where it's not needed, that gives them the ability to perform almost any action and potentially abuse the environment or introduce vulnerabilities, open up the attack surface, right? So something like an entitlement management tool that also looks at your Kubernetes clusters and can identify overly permissive permissions could be helpful here. Number four is just, another risk is not having a centralized policy enforcement mechanism. And so when we talk about policy enforcement, we're talking about the ability to distribute and enforce security policies across multiple clusters, clouds, to be able to manage that risk. And it's also about making sure that you have a certain level of governance, compliance throughout your configuration, right? And in that way, you're centrally managing that governance, that compliance, and you've got consistency across your clusters. And so if you have a tool that can enforce from a centralized perspective policies and ensure a homogeneous enforcement across multiple clusters, and you're not having to do it one by one, which can get very cumbersome as your environment grows, or if you have a containerized environment with a lot of clusters, then that can also, again, help you as you think about building a security program for your containers. Number five, inadequate logging and monitoring. So when we think about a Kubernetes environment, right, you have the ability to generate logs at various levels, right? And when logs are not captured, stored, or actively maintained, then actors have the ability to potentially exploit vulnerabilities, and this can go largely undetected because the logs aren't there for you to then go back and analyze and find out what happened. And much like in most IT scenarios, like logs are what enable you to do incident investigation, as well as response. And so just like you would in any environment, this is also important for your containerized environments, right? Making sure you are capturing, storing, and actively monitoring your logs. Let's see. And then another risk is, if you have broken authentication mechanisms. And so when we think about authentication mechanisms, we're talking about authentication from a human perspective as well as service account perspective, so resource to resource authentication. And so ensuring that you have strong authentication can be really important. And what it does is, as you put this authentication in play, you potentially want to avoid having certs, because if you use certs for your authentication, the API has no way to revoke those certs if it needs to, making it a painful process to potentially rekey a cluster, right? So when you're thinking about how you do your oops, I'm on 6. I just moved ahead. Sorry. Here. When you think about how you're doing your authentication, that can be very important as well. So let's see. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So the next kind of risk is missing network segmentation control. So depending on your environment, the applications, what can communicate with what, right? Maybe you have a strict rule that your test environment can't communicate with prod, and making sure that that's appropriately segmented, making sure that you have the appropriate controls for that segmentation is really important. And so one way to enforce network isolation within Kubernetes is to utilize separate clusters when it's appropriate. You can also use network policies that are built into Kubernetes itself, and those behave like firewall rules, and they can control how your pods communicate. So that those are two ways to support any network segmentation that you need to do based on the rules within your environment. Number 8, big risk is failing to manage your secrets, right? In Kubernetes, a secret is just, a small object that contains sensitive data. It's a password, it's a token, and it's really important that this sensitive data is protected, and it's not accidentally left open for someone to find and then go ahead and use to access your extremely sensitive data, right? It's like the keys to your kingdom. And so when we think about prevention and how you can manage that, it's all about making sure that it's not stored in any place that's open. Always encrypt your backups when it comes to encrypting everything, protecting your keys, things like that. Number 9, misconfigured cluster components. That's another huge risk when we talk about container security and container clusters. Misconfigurations in core Kubernetes components can lead to complete compromise of your clusters, or even worse. And so, you really want to make sure that those components are correctly configured. And again, that's where scanning tools can help you that are looking for those misconfiguration vulnerabilities and are constantly monitoring, right? Because when we think about containers, as your images get updated, right, you have new versions of your image. You want something that's constantly going to scan as you get a new version. And a good place to start is to scan based on CIS benchmarks, right? And to look for potential misconfiguration vulnerabilities based on the CIS benchmark. And so something that's constantly scanning with those parameters in mind can help you ensure that you're catching anything around this component. And then any outdated, vulnerable Kubernetes components also, again, can introduce vulnerabilities, right? Vulnerabilities, they're always going to exist in Kubernetes, and it's up to us to make sure we're following the CVE databases, disclosures, and we understand what's outdated, what's vulnerable, and that there's a patch management plan in place to manage in these scenarios, right? So let's see. From here, actually, I want to kind of do a demo. Just want to stop sharing for a minute. Oops, where am I? Okay. So, this was just, we talked a little bit about the different risks. And again, I'm happy to share these slides following this. There's interactive links, and so you can go to the links and it'll take you to a relevant page, and you can dig as deep as you want, right? So as far as building a program, making sure you build a program that's accounting for those 10 very common risks that can be present across containers is really important. But the other thing that's really important is building a program and identifying a set of tools and processes that enable you to look across your entire application lifecycle, from build to deploy to runtime, in terms of proactively catching risks and then continuously monitoring those risks. And so when we talk about these potential risks, you want a solution that maybe starts during your DevOps cycle, right? And can maybe connect to, any DevOps repository that you might have. And it can enable you to, if you have any custom parameters for your environment, embed those custom rules, and it can do some artifact scanning up front to go ahead and identify, do you have any misconfiguration vulnerabilities, any supply chain risks, those 10 things that we just talked about, something that can do some artifact scanning up front right from your DevOps repository, begin to look and see if you have those potential risks, and then output some results for you from the start. And then as you deploy, something that's going to continuously check for configuration. And then in runtime, from a container perspective, having a tool that can monitor the behavior of the application as it's running also becomes really important. And so, because the static scans, they're going to catch, what's in that image, any vulnerable components, but without then also doing an analysis of what the container and the application is doing during runtime, what you might miss are things like commands or geolocations that the container or application are trying to connect to that maybe they shouldn't, right? And that. And so without that continuous behavioral analysis during runtime as well, you wouldn't catch that. And so having an end-to-end, a program that really enables you to look end-to-end around your containers, your applications, and the security of those applications, I think is really important from a best practice perspective. you'll find a lot of tools that are going to enable you to do the static scans, catch those vulnerabilities. A lot of them will base it on CIS benchmarks. Oftentimes it will drill down to the image layers. It will show you where the vulnerabilities are at the different layers. And then when we get to runtime and doing the behavioral analysis, you have many tools out there that are going to do that as well. But then the other question comes in when you think about the program and the tools you might consider. There'll be various ways in which you can implement it. And that's kind of the second piece you might want to think about. There are solutions out there that are agent-based, and they can give you an end-to-end sort of way of monitoring from, again, development all the way down to runtime in terms of the risks that might be present across your containers. But they might require an agent per container. And so you have to put that agent potentially in your environment. And agents can be intrusive. They can potentially, impact the performance or the cost if you're, running within a cloud service provider environment. And so kind of weighing that trade-off. Now, the trade-off is sometimes if a solution requires agents, maybe they can do deeper analysis. Maybe they can go further in depth, maybe on the dynamic behavioral side. Maybe they can do a better job of catching drift or changes when changes occur. Maybe they can do a better job of more quickly catching any risks if a container image has been updated to a new version, right? And so there's some trade-offs with an agent versus an agent-less solution. But there are solutions out there that are agentless that will also kind of do the end-to-end in terms of static scans down to the runtime behavioral continuous monitoring of events, commands, activity, things like that. And so as you think about building the program, you want to think about, am I going to be able to proactively catch risks? Am I going to be able to continuously monitor? How quickly is the solution going to recognize if I make a change? Will it catch any drift during runtime? Things like that. A lot of times the static analysis, the upfront artifact scanning is table stakes. Almost every kind of tool out there will do it. And where you'll want to begin to drill deeper and look for differentiation is the latter piece in terms of the continuous monitoring, behavioral analysis that tools can do for you during runtime. And so I'm going to pause. I think I gave bits and pieces, right? We started with what are the top 10 risks that you're going to want to look for? And then how might you consider implementing it? Hey, can I talk to you later, please? Sorry, guys. Give me just 1 second.
Many of us have been. Yep. Some today. That's life, my friend.
Okay, sorry guys. So anyway, so we went from kind of what are the top 10 risks to how do you think about implementing it, the life cycle, the types of tools you might consider. I think the last piece is as you think about implementing a container security program, making sure that you have an approach and a set of tools that enable you to quickly consume, get some automated alerts so you can be notified right away, enable you to prioritize appropriately, right? Things like that are really important. And so a tool that might give you a quick visual way to consume a lot of the data so that you can quickly understand the entire landscape can always be helpful and a bit of a differentiator. And I can show a bit of that, but I'm actually just going to pause. I feel like I spoke a lot. I talked a lot. And so, did it make sense? Was it helpful? I could show a little bit on the technology side in terms of a solution I'm familiar with, or we could say, hey, this is good. We don't really want to see the solution itself.
I have a couple of questions, but I'll wait for a couple.
Go ahead.
Well, in your top 10, I wanted to understand, it's just like asking, my questions could be this, which window do you secure in your house? As well, all of them. But in this case, when you were talking about the top 10, statistically, were you ordering them, or were they just random order? Or what are the top ones that you'd have to say, okay, if you're going to do anything for a program, if you're going to set up something, these are the most probable surface areas that we're getting attacked on in Kubernetes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'll just answer that from experience. As far as like how I ordered them on the slide, not necessarily like, hey, the data says this is the very top one, and then this is the second one. The data really was, hey, here's your top 10, not really differentiating across those 10. But from what I've seen and the time that I've spent in working with customers around Kubernetes and the solution offering that we have, I think one of the highest ones of the things that we've talked about so far, or two, I guess, would be overly permissive permissions and supply chain risks. Like those tend to be really high on minds. Like whenever I go into a conversation and we want to talk about container security, like those two things tend to be top of mind of, okay, like how are you going to help me with supply chain risk, because I'm using these open source libraries. I don't necessarily know where components of this image are coming from, right? And that's where the SBOM conversation comes in and becomes really important. And then the permissions piece, right? When we talk about containers or the cloud in general, right? It's very different from what we were used to on-prem, where firewalls were really the way we managed the perimeter, right? The boundaries. But as we talk about cloud, as we talk about container, user credentials, entitlement, right? That role-based access control, that authorization, deeper access really begins to play that pivotal role that firewalls did for us in a traditional on-prem setting in terms of, providing those barriers of protection. And I think permissions like RBAC, it's so easy to accidentally make rules overly permissive, or, like you always want to, it's everyone knows, like you want to err on the side of least privilege, but at the same time, when you're implementing, it's all, human error. It's so easy to, okay, well, I think everyone here needs this, or you forget to remove a permission, or someone leaves and you forget to change a role, someone changes roles, things like that. So I think in the conversations, like I'm talking from experience, not necessarily like the data I read online, which again, if I can share the slides and it has some links and it'll go really in depth with the data. But just from my personal conversations that I've had in various discussions, those two tend to be hot topics. And I guess there's a third one that tends to be hot as well, and that's the behavioral sort of runtime analysis that I don't know was so well captured in those top 10 risks, because it's harder to pinpoint. It's like one of those things where you're not, it's not something that's going to get caught during a static scan, and it's very based on your environment. You know what your application should be connecting to, what your commands your application should be running, right? So there's that, there's a risk of, if there is a malicious actor, someone's trying to do something, how quickly can you catch it? And so that dynamic, at the end, when I talked about end-to-end approach, that latter piece of dynamic runtime analysis, I think plays a really big role in the conversations that I tend to have, like real scenarios, real conversations. Those three pieces tend to play a big role. Does that somewhat answer the question?
Yeah, no, it's good. Any others? I had one more, sorry.
Sure.
Firecracker or K8 OS, which is not really going anywhere. But those type of environments where they're trying to either provide a stronger barrier, where do those fit in your analysis of implementing those or looking at them as a potential way of really guarding or sandboxing your containers?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And if I have to be completely honest, I don't have a good answer for you right now. So rather than try to give you an answer, I'm just gonna be candid. I don't have a good answer.
Okay. Well, do you have a good solution then that we can look at?
For that particular one, I'll have to get back to this crew. But again, I'm happy to share the slides, and I am noting it down. So I am gonna kind of look into it, and I'm happy to maybe Paul share some feedback following if you want to share it with the broader team.
That's great. Thank you.
Yep.
Do you have a demo then?
So I do have something I wanted to show. Again, like this is not me doing like a sales or anything, but there is, I think I spent a little bit of time talking about kind of how there's a trade-off with the there's a lot of solutions in the market. It's a saturated market. And depending on your requirements, what your container footprint looks like, right? You might have a hybrid scenario. You might have a scenario where it's all cloud native containers. And as you think about your requirements, I think I talked about how a lot of times the artifact scanning, the monitoring for misconfigurations, that's table stakes. Almost every solution is going to have it. Where you're going to begin to see some differentiation, and you can begin to think about what do I need relative to what does this offer and the total cost of ownership, is around the runtime analysis, that dynamic behavioral analysis. And there's solutions that require an agent, and then there's solutions that are agentless. Now, I wanted to demonstrate kind of what that behavioral analysis, what I think good looks like, and this solution is agentless in terms of kind of the interface and being able to consume and understand the data quickly and then be able to action it. But I'll also talk about kind of what's missing and where some other vendors might be able to provide that missing piece. And it really comes down to what are the unique needs for your organization at the time that you're looking to implement it. So hopefully that makes sense. That's my preface. And yeah, I'm gonna show you guys a little something. Okay, give me 1 second to share my screen. No. Of course, my internet's not working. Okay. Give me 1 second, guys. I just gotta get logged in. Okay, here it is. Let's see if it lets me. Here we go. Okay, can everyone see my tab?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So this solution is agentless, but the reason I like to show this, and again, I'm not going to talk too much about the static, because again, I think static analysis is table stakes. Almost every solution out there, some of the biggest being Prisma and Wiz, they're very loud CNAP, they're very large CNAP solutions that have container capability. They all do the static scanning, but many will require an agent, and some won't give you a visual, clean way to consume what you're seeing. And so when I say dynamic analysis, what I'm trying to, let's see if I can make this bigger. Hold on. I'm going to fix my screen real quick for you guys. What I'm trying to articulate, and this is a demo environment. So this is actually a really simple container. Most containers are probably going to be much more complex than this. But when I talk about dynamic analysis, the analysis you do continuously during runtime, right? Being able to understand the behavior of your container, and being able to recognize if a container image has been updated and rerun that analysis in a continuous and automated fashion. I'm talking about being able to visualize the behavior in terms of the events. So this is an example of, being able to see the commands that this container is running, being able to visually quickly consume and see what geolocations the container is trying to connect to, and being able to see it in this clean graphical format. Now, Some will give you this data, but it'll give it to you in more of a written format that may not be as easy to consume. And again, this is a really simple container image because it's a demo environment. But a lot of times your container image is going to be significantly more complex with likely many more commands or many more points that it's trying to connect to and processes in between. And so being able to visualize it cleanly, drill into the requests and say, okay, yeah, that makes sense, or it doesn't make sense, right? This is not something that can get flagged as a risk based on CIS benchmarks. This is something that's going to be based on your environment, your application, and what you know it should be doing, right? And the remote host that it should be connecting to, right? All this maps to the visual that you saw in the beginning. Any forensic analysis would show up. You've got your terminal output. And so just having a clean way to consume, I think, is one way to understand and differentiate between solutions. Now, what you don't see here that I think is another differentiator for a solution as you consider building a container security program and something that's robust is a solution that gives you all this insight, but then also enables you to monitor drift during runtime. And so maybe you have your container image, you have a baseline, and you want to be able to be alerted if some change has been made given your baseline, right? That's something that you're not seeing here that can also be really valuable. So depending on where you are in your container journey, the maturity of your organization, your requirements, that drift component could be really important. And there are certainly solutions that are out there that offer that as well, right? So I think, as you think about your container security program and what you need, understanding your requirements, what's important, kind of where you are in your container journey, and thus how sophisticated your solution needs to be, right? There's various different bells and whistles. You can figure out what really do I need, and in that way manage the total cost of ownership with respect to whatever you're leveraging to build out your container security program versus what you need. So anyway, it was quick. I don't want to show everything, right? I'm not, again, this is not like a sales pitch. I'm not trying to make this a demo, but that's a piece, again, I show because I think the dynamic, the runtime analysis piece is where, as you look across different solutions, you can hone in on differentiation. Of course, there's also what container orchestration platforms do they support? Although we're talking about Kubernetes here, so that's really easy, right? But there's OpenShift, also what environments, private, public registries, right? So there's a lot of conversations that you can have, but a lot of that is, I would say, table stakes. Like most good solutions should support most of it. And then you come down to kind of how deep can it go? And again, the runtime piece is where I tend to see solutions vary more, if that makes any sense. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm just going to stop sharing. But so that was it. That was what I had. I hope it was helpful. I hope it was useful for this group. And I hope it gives the team some things to think about in terms of how to think about the components of a program around container security, and then maybe how to think about the solutions and tools that might be out there to support the program that you might want to build.
I didn't even know there was a top 10 from OWASP for Kubernetes, so I've definitely learned some things.
Good. And I'll send, I'm happy to send the information for anyone that wants it, right? Just click on the links, go as deep as you'd like.
Maybe if you can send them to me in the email, and then I'll make sure it gets disseminated.
Yeah, I'll post it in the Slack.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. You'll just have to give me a little bit because I'm going to clean it up. I have a ton of other content on those slides. So I'll clean it up and I'll send you the relevant ones for you to share.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Have a good evening.
Bye.